Thank you, Ian, and endorsed your speech, and I think there were a lot of interesting issues that you raised. Hearing my bio read out, I think I might need to rewrite it. It sounds a little bit alarming, but I would really like to thank you for inviting me to speak today. It's an honour and a privilege, and it is quite personal for me as well. Independent Living and the Centre for Independent Living, both in Hampshire and in Southampton, have touched me in my career through adult social services at a number of points over the last 30 years, and my career goes back further than 30 years. I'd just like to kind of recount perhaps a little bit of my early experience, and this is going to be kind of a personal perspective. But before I launch into that, I just would like to say, from a Hampshire County Council Adult Services point of view, that there is immense respect and gratitude for the work that we've done in partnership over the last few years. The Centres for Independent Living and the principles of the disability movement have percolated through into adult services. We still haven't got it right. There's a long way to go, but I think the dialogue and the challenge that has been brought to us in Hampshire around the way we deliver services has been heard and mainly welcomed. There have been disagreements along the way, and we need to acknowledge that. And as I say, we don't always get it right, but I think we're on a journey together. I was really struck by the title of this presentation, The First 30 Years, which did suggest a journey going on for much longer, and I thought, blimey, I hope it isn't another 30 years, but I think listening to you, I acknowledge there are a huge number of challenges that still need to be addressed, and as you say, it's not just about money. But I'd like to go back more than 30 years. I think my first contact with the disability movement and the concepts of independent living happened when I was a full-time officer in the Students' Union at Southampton University, and I was involved at that time in the development of Clarkson House, which was a purpose-built hall of residence for disabled students. And I was asked, and I'm not quite sure how it happened, but I was asked to show a prospective student around the campus. And that prospective student was Simon Brissenden, and he obviously was one of the co-founders of the Centre for Independent Living in Southampton. So I met Simon, and I think it was a pretty scary experience for both of us, in that I showed him around the campus, and I certainly didn't have the skills, awareness, competency, sensitivity, as I think you would expect from a good PA these days. I whizzed him around the campus. I didn't take any account of whether there were dropped curbs. I hadn't considered stairs. And it was a bit of a gallop, and at the end of it, he looked quite physically shell-shocked, and I thought, maybe I haven't got this right. And certainly, I was struck by his absolute intellect. He had quite an acerbic sense of humour, and he certainly left me with the impression that perhaps I really hadn't got it right. And that experience lived with me, but what he left me with was this overwhelming strength of his personality, both to get to university and experience university life, but also to achieve his independence. He wasn't going to have the likes of me telling him what his life at university was going to be like. I didn't get to know Simon very well, but from a distance did observe the work that he did and began to do in Southampton with the development of the independent living movement. And then later on in my career, I began to have touch points that continued to influence certainly my thinking and my approach to my work as a social worker. And I know that Simon wasn't just a leader in the independent movement, but he went on and wrote poetry, did a lot of writing, and a load of other things, and I had a still overwhelming respect and admiration for what he achieved. So in preparing for today, there was kind of, I had ideas shooting off all over the place, but I thought maybe I should just think back to those early days of when I started in social work, and where were we in terms of independent living. And I remember I started as an unqualified social worker in 1979, and was given a caseload of people. And on that caseload was a young disabled woman who basically having relationship difficulties with her mother. She wanted to leave home, mum didn't want her to leave home, and they were having a lot of rows. And I, as a naive 22-year-old, without any training, was asked to support her. I opened the case file and I was shocked, absolutely shocked, to find that first of all her disabilities were described in terms of the poor law, and I'm not going to use the words, but 30 years ago there was language in a social services case file that even then was totally unacceptable. But even more distressing, I think there was a view that the solution to this young woman's life was sheltered work in a workshop, and probably at best group living of some form or other. And even more worrying is I discovered that she was receiving regular contraceptive injections, which she had been told were vitamins. And there was absolutely no concept of this woman's rights or her hopes or aspirations. And that, I think, neatly, she wasn't the only one, but for me, she neatly illustrated the kind of state that we were in terms of both understanding and having ambition around people's lives. I went on to qualify then as a social worker, and in 1983 we were just beginning to see through the social work training programme the seeds of the concept of the social model of disability. But in those days, service users, and I know that has changed as well, service users didn't have input into the training. There was no service user or disabled person's voice in the training. There was a lot of academic stuff that was delivered. And as I say, but within all of that, there were the seeds of the social model of disability. And I can remember having, back in those days, some quite exciting discussions about this really new concept that was being presented to us by some of the academics. So as early as 1983, when I was training, some of those ideas were beginning to percolate through. I then went on to start work as a qualified social worker, and I worked in mental health services. And if I thought my caseload as an unqualified social worker was bad, I was really thrown in the deep end with the sorts of long-stay institutional care that we were providing for a lot of disabled people and people with mental health problems. So I went into Knoll. I worked with people at Knoll and Coldies who've been incarcerated in those Victorian institutions, and it is, thank God, that we have those no more. We are not perfect, but we have come a long way in those 30 years from that sort of abuse, I think, in the way that we treated people. So looking back does give me hope about looking forward. A lot has been achieved over the period of my career, and I am very optimistic that that can be built on. And although times are really challenging at the moment, we won't be going back to those sorts of circumstances that I experienced at the beginning of my career. Moving on through my career in Hampshire, there have been some pivotal moments, and individuals and organisations have clearly impacted not only on the way I thought and behaved as a professional social worker, but on the organisation of Hampshire County Council, and Project 81, and there are people in this room absolutely part of it, where people approached the local authority to leave a residential care home and manage a self-operated care scheme, was something that Hampshire County Council is really proud of. But I know that it would not have happened without the absolute tenacity and drive of that group of disabled people themselves. There were one or two allies in the local authority, and the late lamented Derek Bailey was a principal officer at the time in Hampshire County Council, who was apparently, I did meet him a few times, and he had an office that was piled with paper and smoked in his office, which even in those days was not very acceptable. And I think was a quirky individual by all accounts. But he was radical enough to see that this was something that absolutely needed to be supported. And he, I think, provided a useful ally to those people fighting for independence and the creation of, I think we claim, one of the first models of direct payments and self-operated care scheme. And certainly that campaign and the outcomes of that campaign shaped the thinking of the local, certainly the local authority, adult services, in those days social services department, and has been rooted in our history and culture, and it's something that we refer back to, something that we hold on to, and something that we are really proud of. And that, I think, has helped to sustain some of the approaches that we're doing now. That was also followed up, and I should mention Chris Taylor, who replaced Eric after that time, who was again, I think, another ally, an acknowledged ally in the move towards independent living. And I hope that we've tried to maintain that tradition as we've moved on within adult services. So coming closer to today, I mean, the other episode I think I should refer to, I think, is the development of direct payments in Southampton. Because having worked in Hampshire for a while, we had local government review. Southampton split off from Hampshire, and I moved, albeit briefly, to work for Southampton City Council. And on arrival, was told, well, we have the new Direct Payments Act. We would like you to implement that in the city. We've been through a bit of a tussle in Hampshire, as I remember, as we tried to shift from the self-operated care scheme to direct payments, and it was not a smooth transition. And there was a lot of legal and financial wrangling about the art of the possible. Something that we've been doing really successfully suddenly became the domain of lawyers and accountants, and suddenly it all seemed so much more difficult. So I'd had the experience of that, observing that struggle in Hampshire, and thought, I don't want to replicate that in Southampton. And I remember sitting, and I think it was in Northlands Road, on a sunny afternoon with I'm sure Ian was there, but a group of disabled people having a very free and frank discussion about how direct payments should be implemented in Southampton. And I also remember going back into the City Council and fighting lawyers and accountants about how we should be implementing this, and trying to represent the views of disabled people that had been put very forcibly to me. But I think it wasn't my activity. I was again an ally in a process of campaigning that happened within the city to make sure direct payments was implemented in a way that was at least 3/4 of the way acceptable to people who needed them. So again, a really powerful experience and a kind of episode in my career from which I learned a lot. So coming up to recent years, we've had a really positive experience of working with SCIL and people who were also members of the Hampshire Centre for Independent Living. And that's ranged from really proactive participation in the personalisation commission that the leader of the council led a number of years ago, where I think the voice of disabled people was very articulated, very well articulated and heard. And the development then of the personalisation expert panel, where a group of disabled people approached the council and said, we've talked about personalisation, work with us in co-production because we know how to implement it. And that support, advice and guidance on the development of personalisation has been really helpful. And again, we don't get it right. We invented a very bureaucratic process and have had some robust feedback about the effectiveness of other. We are still on that journey about getting it right. We've also learned a lot, I think, from the movement around co-production and that whole new language about co-production, parity of engagement and working together, not just about consultation, but actually equality of partnerships to deliver services in a new and different way. And that, again, we're still on that journey to deliver that, but that I think is beginning to change the culture of the organisation. And Ian mentioned Centrepo put on a very impressive conference around co-production and commissioning of services, and I think there's a lot more that we can do looking at at that co-commissioning and using the underpinning principles and values of the disability movement, as Ian says, not just in a narrow way, but right across the piece for people who need the support of adult services in different ways. We've also, I think, worked together and heard together the importance of both peer support and the development of the user-led organisations across the county, and that's something that we've tried to support SCIL in delivering, because we recognise that that is the future for direction for support for people, that relying entirely on delivery from the state, albeit the local state and a state, an organisation that does try to listen to people fundamentally. I think the future lies within self-organisation and people able to support their peers. So we've been happy to support that, and in terms of future direction, that's the sort of conversation that we need to be having on an ongoing basis. The final point is just to mention the CARE Act. One of the key principles around advocacy is now in the CARE Act, and there have clearly been some influences from the voice of disabled people in the CARE Act. The CARE Act still leaves a lot to be desired. We haven't got the sorts of rights that I think the movement wants to see enshrined in legislation, but there has been a baby step towards that, and I think that's helpful. I don't want to say any more at the moment, but I'm very happy to answer questions, and again, thank you very much for inviting me.